I'm your bedtime historian, and I've always found it funny that a boy born to rule a kingdom could still be terrified of shadows on cold stone walls. Behind those grand Tudor tapestries, fear lived and breathed a whiff of ink on parchment, a cough in the corridor, a dagger in the dark. Imagine soft candlelight flickering over a child's wide eyes as royal whispers coil through halls too drafty to hide secrets. What monsters haunt a prince who must survive to become a king when his family's ghosts are never truly buried? If stories like this keep your mind busier than tomorrow's to-do list, maybe give that, like button, a sleepy nudge and subscribe so you don't miss the next midnight tale. And if you're half awake, listening to royal gossip right now, tell me who's your favorite historical ruler to lose sleep over. Now dim the lights, settle deeper under your blanket, and follow the hush of the court's corridors as we drift into Henry's first uneasy nights. You slip through the drafty chambers of Greenwich Palace, where young Henry Tudor lies awake in a bed carved for a prince, yet far too big for a boy. His breath forms little clouds in the winter air, and he pulls the covers tighter, pretending the cold is all that makes him shiver. But you know, it's not just the chill. It's the muffled footsteps outside, the urgent whispers of servants, the sudden hush when a door creaks open. It was here, surrounded by tapestries stitched with hunting scenes and foreign battles, that Henry's mind learned its oldest trick: imagine danger, prepare for betrayal. His father, Henry VII, kept the realm stitched together with paranoia, fearing rival claims from Yorkists and foreign dukes alike. And so, the boy watched, listened, and learned fear could keep you alive, but it never let you sleep. Historians still argue whether young Henry's mind was shaped more by cold facts or family ghost stories. Some say his mother's death left a gap no courtly ceremony could fill. Others claim the boy's real education began when he overheard the threats against his older brother Arthur, the heir who died too soon. By candlelight, a lonely second son lay awake wondering if the same fever would find him next. It's easy now to picture him as the Golden Prince, jousting and feasting, yet in these earliest hours, Henry was just a small boy in a vast palace. A place where every draught could carry rumors of poison, every cough could mean plague. And while royal physicians promised safety with lavender sachets and holy relics under the pillow, they offered no cure for a mind that replayed footsteps in the hall all night long. One curious detail: the boy Henry is said to have demanded his bed be moved closer to the hearth whenever the wind howled, a tiny sign of the giant who would one day break an entire church to feel secure. Some scholars remain puzzled by how this child of privilege learned to sleep so lightly and trust so poorly. Perhaps the only certainty is that sleepless nights shape restless kings. Tonight you listen for the same echoes he did, footsteps soft as secrets wine tapping at stained glass, the creak of oak doors behind the velvet curtains. Breathe slower now. The court sleeps fitfully around you, and far down the corridor a young heir counts shadows instead of sheep, already dreaming of crowns that gleam and daggers that glint behind smiles. Outside that dim bedchamber, morning breaks like a reluctant promise, dragging the young Henry from nightmares into lessons that feel just as heavy. You wander with him now, down narrow stone halls, echoing with the scratch of quills, the mutter of tutors, the soft rustle of silk gowns slipping past. There is no roaring crowd, yet no thunder of hooves, only a boy expected to wear the shape of a king before he even grows into his own skin. In these early days, Henry was not meant to be king at all. His older brother Arthur, firstborn well-mannered and already groomed for rule, held that heavy future in his thin hands. But fevers are merciless, and so a young second son with a love for wrestling and music suddenly found a crown waiting where a cricket bat might have been. Historians still argue how prepared he truly was, whether he inherited a realm or an inescapable trap woven from alliances and expectations. You glimpse him at lessons, Latin verbs inked on scraps of parchment, a lute leaned against the corner, dusty scrolls that smell of candle smoke and stale air. Outside the tilt yard, calls louder than any monk's droning chant. Already Henry wants to swap scrolls for spear's ink for sweat. There's a curious fact you might like. His tutors often complained that the young prince would slip away from dry lessons to practice archery in the gardens, a bow in hand, when he should have held a book. Some scholars remain divided over whether these distractions were boyish rebellion or an early sign of a king who would forever confuse pleasure with power. Even now, you feel it, a prince half listening to his own coronation being whispered behind doors, dreaming not of policy, but of jousts and feasts that prove his might. When his brother Arthur died in 1502, the air in Greenwich shifted overnight. Rumors say Henry's mother wept herself sick. The king grew colder still. But for Henry, the unexpected heir, the change was more unsettling than triumphant. One day, a spare son free to chase hounds and play at knighthood. The next, a future that weighed as much as the iron crown he would one day bear. Walk with him now to his first Privy Council meetings. Small feet swing under an oak table, too high for his boots to touch the ground. Courtiers bow low, but eye him sideways, measuring the boy who will soon rule them all. They speak of taxes, treaties, and threats from Scotland, words that drone like bees around his head, while his mind drifts to the hunt he's missing in the royal park. One odd rumor claims Henry used to carve tiny symbols into the underside of the table, small marks only he understood, talismans against the weight of grown men's secrets pressing in. Some say they were just childish doodles. Others whisper they were a boy's spell for courage carved into oak that had heard centuries of half-truths. So here sits a not-quite king, half dreaming of tournaments, half shivering at every cough and rumor of plots. Surviving records offer conflicting tales of how seriously he took these lessons. Some paint a picture of a clever lad, quick to learn statecraft. Others insist he was more eager to flirt and fence than listen to old men lecture about coins and kingship. But what's certain is this. When that golden crown finally settled on his head, it did so over a mind still tuned to boyhood distractions, sport song, the thrill of a roaring crowd. A king was born, but perhaps never fully built for the patient grind of governance. You follow him now out of the council chamber into a bright courtyard where a young Henry squints at the sky, wondering if ruling England could ever feel half as free as swinging a sword in a sunlit field. The echo of laughter drifts down the palace corridors, riotous, careless, edged with the clink of goblets and the scrape of platters piled high with roasted meats. You wander through the great hall now, where the newly crowned Henry feasts like a man trying to swallow his fears whole. Somewhere between the boar's head and the honeyed wine, his teeth begin their long, slow surrender to rot and ruin. Tudor feasts were grand theaters of power, whole stags glazed in spices from distant lands, pies stuffed with blackbirds, gilded sugar sculptures melting under candlelight. Henry relished every crumb. Some say he dined with an appetite meant to hush any murmur that he was too young, too green to rule. If the king could devour a banquet meant for 10 men, surely he could devour his enemies too. Historians still debate whether his lavish meals were about pleasure or proof evidence that England's coffers were full, its king generous and strong. Yet behind the platters of venison and barrels of ale lurked decay. You might find it odd to learn that the king's famed smile, once dazzling, turned into a battlefield of blackened stumps by his middle years. Tudor dentists, if you could call them, that recommended rinses of vinegar and wine, but little else. And so the feasts that made him seem powerful also gnawed away at him, bite by sugary bite. Step closer to the long oak table. You see servants hover ready to whisk away bones and refill trenchers. Courtiers sip spiced wine forced to laugh at jokes and flatter the king's appetite. One curious detail survives in a letter from a visiting ambassador. He noted how Henry would sometimes toss scraps to favored dogs at his feet, their snapping jaws a softer echo of the court's own hunger for royal favor. The king's feasts grew more elaborate as the years passed. Imagine peacocks, with feathers reattached after roasting, posed in lifelike splendor atop silver platters. Dancers weave between tables. Musicians pluck lutes by flickering torchlight, while Henry's booming laugh drowns out the scrape of knives on trenchers. Yet inside that swirl of music and meat, you can almost hear his teeth cracking under the sugar-glazed pastries, the candied fruit from Spain, the mountains of marzipan. Some scholars remain puzzled by how little he changed his habits, even as pain settled deep in his jaw. Did he ignore the rot out of pride? Or did he crave the nightly excess as a brief escape from the loneliness that nipped at his heels? Whispers say he took to stuffing cloves and rosewater into his mouth to mask the stench and open secret at court, one nobody dared mention above a whisper. The great hall becomes a stage each night. Henry sits at its heart, a king surrounded by loyalists and spies alike. Servants clear plates heavy with half-chewed meat. The musicians tune softer notes as the evening bleeds into night. You stand behind the throne now, watching as the king leans back, cheeks flushed from wine eyes glimmering in the torchlight. For a few hours he can pretend all is well. No plots, no ulcers, no court physicians whispering about hidden decay. Feasts for Henry were more than gluttony. They were armor-roasted swan and sugared pears, standing guard against the rumors of weakness. Yet each bite hollowed him out in secret, rotting him from within, long before the ulcers and wounds that would come later. Now the hall empties. Candles gutter laughter drifts into snores behind heavy doors. The king wipes his mouth with a silk sleeve, already plotting the next banquet, the next night's revelry that will hush the cold dread creeping through his restless dreams. And you, drifting just behind him, see what his courtiers never dared admit. The crown's shine is bright enough to blind, but never enough to hide the rot that blooms when the feasting ends. Slip away from the echoing hall and follow the king's shadow down a candlelit corridor, one that twists through whispered secrets and velvet curtains pulled tight against prying eyes. Here lies the soft thrum of Tudor gossip, hushed talk of queens discarded like half-finished banquets, rings exchanged under desperate vows, and kisses that carried both hope and doom. 6 wives, 6 chances at an heir, 6 mirrors for a king's restless heart. In these quiet corridors, you trace the threads of Catherine Anne Jane Anne again, Catherine again, and Catherine once more. Each story drifts into the next, like an uneasy dream you can't quite wake from. Some scholars still debate whether Henry's endless hunger for marriage was truly about sons and succession, or something lonelier, a gnawing fear of dying unloved. Picture the first queen, Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, who came to England wrapped in piety and royal duty. She gave Henry his first taste of legitimacy, an alliance with Spain, a polished courtly image, a hope for healthy heirs. Yet their bedsheets turned cold as miscarriages piled sorrow upon sorrow. Historians note how Henry's love for Catherine soured in the same chambers where they once laughed a bitterness that seeped into palace walls like damp. Then came Anne Boleyn, a flash of wit-dark eyes and rumors that her touch could bend a king's will. You hear the rustle of silk as she glides past guards who tremble to meet her gaze. Some say she enchanted him with French perfumes and cunning smiles. Others whisper he enchanted himself, desperate for something new, when old hopes faded. Whatever the truth, this queen's whispered rise ended with a blade's cold whisper at dawn. There's a curious detail you may like. Anne's final days were haunted not just by betrayal, but by ghostly gossip that her sixth finger, if it even existed, was proof of witchcraft. Some scholars remain puzzled by how quickly a crown could turn to an executioner's block, as if the king's love had always come with a hidden price. Jane Seymour followed soft-spoken and pale as linen in moonlight. She gave him what no other wife did a son Edward, who would outlive his mother by only a few heartbeats. Courtiers noted how the king wept beside Jane's deathbed, a moment of true grief, flickering in a man so used to shedding wives like winter cloaks. Yet grief for Henry never dulled desire. Another Anne waited in the wings. Anne of Cleves, the awkward German princess painted prettier than she appeared in the flesh. Legend says Henry recoiled at first sight, cursing the artist who'd lied with brush and oil. The marriage dissolved before it began the only wife who walked away with her head held high and her neck intact. Next, Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl, giggling in velvet chambers, her secrets slipping through court like perfume in candlelight. But secrets have sharp edges, and her brief reign ended under the same blade that ended Anne's. The final Catherine Parr outlasted them all, a nursemaid queen who soothed his ulcers, his paranoia, his ever-growing fear that God's wrath rode in every fever and miscarriage. Historians still argue whether these marriages were the king's greatest folly or his deepest curse. Perhaps it was both love and legacy tangled so tightly they strangled whatever peace Henry's restless mind might have found. Tonight, you stand in the hush of his royal bedchamber, velvet drapes drawn tight secrets, breathing in the dark. 6 wives whisper in these walls, each a ghost with a story, each a reminder that even a king who breaks kingdoms for love can never quite escape the cold stone loneliness waiting on the other side of the bed. Drift deeper into the chambers beyond the royal bed, where torchlight flickers over tapestries and the echo of armored footsteps fades into the hush of silk sheets. Here Henry's once mighty frame becomes its own prison, a body sculpted for jousts and hunts, now betraying him with every swollen joint and festering wound. In his youth, the king cut a figure so athletic that foreign ambassadors marveled at his broad shoulders and booming laugh. You see him there, thundering across the tilt yard on horseback lance, lowered the crowd roaring as splinters fly from shattered shields. He lived for that clash of wood and metal, for the adrenaline that silenced restless thoughts about heirs and traitors lurking in dark corners. But the body that conquered tournaments could not conquer time or poor fortune. Historians still debate which blow doomed him most, the tilt in 1536, when a horse fell and pinned him to the ground, or the countless minor injuries before, that each bruise and cut a whisper of decay to come. Some say the king never truly stood tall again after that day in Greenwich. when his armor crushed flesh and bone like parchment under boot. There's a curious detail buried in physicians' notes. One surgeon described packing Henry's wounds with linen soaked in wine and honey, hoping to draw out infection with sweetness and prayer. But the leg never healed. Beneath layers of silk and ermine ulcers bloomed weeping through bandages, no matter how many times they were changed. You trail him down palace halls, watching courtiers bow too low to smell the rot. The king still thunders his commands, feasts like a conqueror, but his gait grows stiff, his steps more careful. A small stool appears beside his throne, a place to prop the swollen leg that makes his moods swing like a rusty weather vane. Some scholars remain puzzled by how this powerful monarch feared across Europe could not conquer a single infected sore. Rumors at court grow with every limp. Some claim the festering wound poisoned his mind, turning sharp temper into cruelty. Others wonder if the pain simply stripped away the masks of charm and pageantry, revealing a man as human as any stable boy he'd once thundered past on the tilt yard. He tries to ride again some days, forcing himself into armor that chafes raw skin just to remind the realm he is still the king who breaks lances and bones alike. But the saddle grows harder to mount the crowds at the jousts, quieter, the whispers louder than cheers. One night, servants say, they found him staring into a basin of bloodied bandages, muttering prayers to saints he barely trusted. A king brought low by the same body he once paraded as proof of divine favor. There's an irony to it that even his harshest critics admired in hushed tones behind closed doors. You stand at the foot of his bed now watching as Henry tosses and turns sheets, twisted around a leg that refuses to heal. Courtiers shuffle past the heavy oak doors, carrying poultices and prayers, but none dare speak, the fear that sticks to the candlelit air. What happens when the king's mighty frame can no longer bear the weight of the crown? Historians still argue whether his festering wounds drove him to paranoia, spurring darker laws and crueler punishments to keep the realm in line when he himself could no longer stand straight. Perhaps that rotting leg was more than an infection. It was a warning, pulsing just beneath velvet robes that no armor can shield a king from his own slow unraveling. You hear it too, the soft rustle of sheets, the groan of old bones, the quiet promise that this once mighty body is already writing the last lines of its own legend. Step softly now into the shadowy corner of the king's chamber, where candle stubs burn low beside brass basins and chipped ceramic jars. This is where the royal healers gather physicians, apothecaries, and the ever-present swarm of leech keepers, each promising salvation in a vial of herbs or a jar of hungry worms. Once, Henry's court physicians were paraded as proof of England's sophistication, university men draped in fur-lined gowns, muttering Latin charms as they measured pulses with cold fingertips. Now they hover over the king's bloated leg and feverish brow, whispering cures more medieval than miraculous. Historians still argue whether these learned men prolonged his suffering out of ignorance or desperation to please a ruler whose temper turned deadly at the faintest hint of weakness. You can almost smell the sharp tang of vinegar and the coppery sweetness of clotted blood. A curious detail lingers in the diaries of court scribes. Some nights, the king's healers bled him so often that pages stained their records red as they documented each ounce drained from royal veins. The theory was simple. Bad humors must be let out like poison drained from a festering well. Sometimes the king submitted to these rituals with the stoicism of a knight girding for battle. Other times, servants claim he roared curses that rattled the gold leaf on chapel ceilings. Leeches squirmed in glass jars by the hearth, their shadows dancing like tiny devils waiting to feast. It was said the king's moans echoed down corridors where courtiers held handkerchiefs to their noses, pretending not to smell the rot that no bleeding could purge. You wander through these half-lit chambers, stepping past bundles of dried herbs, sage, rosemary, mint, meant to ward off stench and spirits alike. Somewhere in this muddle of medieval medicine sits a truth. The more they treated him, the more the king's faith in his own flesh eroded. Some scholars remain puzzled by why he never turned to more radical cures. But perhaps the fear of failure was sharper than any scalpel. Picture the royal apothecary stirring honey and crushed pearls into syrup to soothe Henry's hacking cough. Imagine linen soaked in vinegar wrapped tight around ulcered flesh. These treatments were as much theater as remedy, an elaborate show that told courtiers their king still commanded the powers of life and death, even as his pulse betrayed him. Servants whisper about the nights they found the king half asleep, muttering orders to invisible physicians, long dead, ancient Greek names like Galen and Hippocrates, woven into fevered dreams. It's a soft, unsettling reminder that behind every grand decision wars waged, wives discarded, lurked the hush of these chambers, the flicker of candlelight on brass instruments sharp enough to drain away more than just blood. One winter night, the healers tried a daring poultice of honey and oil, binding the king's wound so tightly that the flesh beneath turned purple from trapped infection. Some say it worked for a while. Some say it nearly killed him faster. Surviving records conflict on whether the king begged for more or cursed every man who dared touch his rotting leg. Here, in this circle of shadows, you can almost sense how helpless power can feel when the flesh refuses to obey. A ruler who once commanded armies now commands leeches who come and go with no respect for crowns or titles. The gentle drip of candle wax marks the hours until the next incision, the next draining, the next whispered promise that this time the king might sleep painlessly through the night. But sleep rarely comes easy to a body, so betrayed by its own blood. And so the healers hover still scraping, draining promising to draw out the sickness, but only draining away the last illusions of immortality that once wrapped around the house of Tudor like iron plate. Slip past the creaking door now beyond the realm of poultices and leeches, and drift into the innermost sanctum of Henry's world, the royal bedchamber, where secrets breathed louder than prayers. Thick velvet curtains draped the massive four-poster bed like a stage set for whispered intrigues and restless nights that no crown could soothe. By day, this room brimmed with polished formality, chamberlains' pages, and favored courtiers drifting in with silver basins and embroidered nightshirts. By night, all that grandeur fell away, leaving behind a king tangled in sheets that smelled faintly of sweet herbs and sour sweat. Historians still debate just how much of England's fate was shaped right here, in the flickering candlelight, beside rumpled pillows and half-drunk goblets of spiced wine. Imagine stepping closer now. The rushes on the floor are newly strewn with lavender and mint to mask the scent of old wounds. Beside the bed, a low table bears the remnants of a late-night supper, a few sugared plums, a silver goblet smeared with red wine, a carving knife resting on a crust of bread. These small leftovers tell you more about the king's mind than any royal decree. A curious detail survives in a chambermaid's secret notes. how Henry insisted on sleeping with a dagger under his pillow, as if he half expected betrayal to creep through the bed curtains before dawn. Some nights he would wake in a sweat, calling for servants to search the room for spies or traitors hidden behind drapes and tapestries. They found nothing, but the king's eyes never fully closed again. The royal bedchamber was also England's most dangerous confessional. Here queens wept, lovers pleaded, ministers leaned in close to murmur promises and warnings. What was spoken under heavy quilts might shape marriages, rebellions, or quiet deaths that history books reduced to footnotes. Some scholars remain puzzled by how freely Henry unburdened his fears at night, only to roar them into iron laws by dawn. Lean closer to the bed's carved posts, feel the tiny grooves worn smooth where the king's rings scraped as he tossed and turned. Even in sleep, power weighed on him like chainmail stitched into a nightshirt. Rumors swirl that Catherine Parr, the final queen, often read him to sleep with psalms and gentle lessons, her voice threading through the dusk like a hymn that might soothe the ulcers gnawing at him from within. Yet the hush of the royal bedchamber was never complete. Courtiers lurking beyond the door strained to catch muffled words. Did the king name a new heir? Did he plot revenge against a duke's whispered slight? One odd fact lingers in the diaries of a page boy. Sometimes, Henry would rouse himself near dawn and scribble notes to be hidden beneath his mattress, a strange ritual to outwit the enemies he imagined circling just beyond the velvet canopy. You stand now at the foot of that vast bed, the air heavy with old secrets and the soft rustle of linen shifting under a restless king. Each night, as the kingdom dreamed beyond stone walls, its ruler lay awake, haunted not only by plots and power, but by the simple truth that no bed, however grand, can keep out the creeping shadows of regret. Historians still argue whether Henry's restless nights were born of a guilty conscience or a mind simply worn thin by infection and fear. Perhaps both are true, an aging lion half devoured by his own hunger for control, yet unable to find peace even beneath blankets embroidered with Tudor roses. Tonight, you leave him there, half asleep, half listening to every creak of oak, every sigh of wind against the shutters, every phantom footstep that might be a servant, or a ghost carrying secrets that never quite stay buried beneath royal sheets. Step out from behind the bed curtains now, and drift down the palace corridors, where whispers slip like drafts under carved oak doors. Here in shadowy alcoves, and by flickering candlelight, courtiers gather in tight knots, heads bent close, voices lowered to the hush of secrets too sharp to speak aloud. These murmurs fed the rumor that their king, mighty and gluttonous by day, trembled on the edge of something darker by night, a madness coiled tight behind his bloodshot eyes. Some say it began with the fevers, years of wounds that never closed, the sickly sweetness of rotting flesh that made servants look away. Some say it was guilt that did it. Wives lost friends, executed daughters, banished when they did not bend. Historians still argue whether Henry's shifting moods were proof of divine punishment or simply a mind unraveling under the weight of too many sins and too few allies left to shoulder them. You wander through this maze of murmurs. In the council chamber, quills scratch as advisors record decrees that swing wildly from mercy to cruelty. One day, a trusted minister shares the king's wine at supper. The next, that same man's head rolls into a straw basket in the Tower courtyard before dawn. There's a curious detail in the letters of a Spanish envoy he wrote home, that the king's moods shifted like English weather-stormy rage at breakfast, forced jests by supper, then black silence until the cock crowed again. It wasn't only his enemies who whispered of madness. Friends, too, learned to guard their words to flatter carefully. One misplaced joke about the king's festering leg could mean exile or worse. Some scholars remain puzzled by how so many stayed loyal, tiptoeing through a court where yesterday's jest could become tomorrow's execution order. Picture a candlelit chamber, lined with tapestries of hunting scenes and faded saints. A cluster of courtiers lean close as the fire crackles. They murmur of Henry's late-night rants, of his fear that shadows behind the drapes conceal assassins sent by Rome or Spain. They pass on stories of him pacing long after the palace sleeps, raving at invisible traitors. And always the same question: if the king truly slips into madness, who will dare stop him? One odd tale lingers in the dusty pages of an old courtier's memoir: how Henry once ordered a mirror removed from his bedchamber because he claimed it mocked him. Some say he saw visions there. Wives accusing him from the glass blood pooling at his feet, the reflection of a crown that felt heavier each time he glimpsed it. You step deeper into these murmurs, feeling how fear shapes every flick of a quill, every nod at counsel. Beneath the royal canopy, power looks absolute. But here in the half-lit corners, that same power trembles, held together by bribes, rumors, and the hope that the king's mind might hold firm one more year, one more week, one more night. Historians still debate whether this spiral into suspicion was inevitable for a ruler who made betrayal a habit and paranoia a crown jewel. Or perhaps the madness was simply the final payment for a life spent gnawing at the edges of loyalty and faith until nothing stable remained. Tonight, you drift down the corridor past closed chamber doors. Behind them, secrets tighten like knots in a hangman's rope. A courtesan lifts her skirts over the cold flagstones, careful not to let her whispers echo. A scribe sneaks a glance over his shoulder as he copies orders that might tomorrow be deemed treasonous. And far away, behind a heavy door, guarded by halberds, the king mutters in his sleep, half threats, half prayers, while his courtiers dream of a day when the throne might be steadier than the mind that holds it. Move softly now through the shadowed halls where candlelight dances on armored guards who stand too still to speak the truth they carry in their watchful eyes. Here, at the frayed edge of Henry's reign, plots flicker like hidden embers, small conspiracies kept half alive by servants' whispers, courtiers' sly glances, and secret notes folded into glove palms when no one looks. You wander with these half-buried schemes, slipping behind tapestry panels and up narrow stairs where messages pass from trembling fingers to eager ears. In these final years, the king's court becomes a stage for hushed betrayals. Historians still argue how many threats were real and how many were born of fear feeding on itself. Some plots fizzled into rumor. Others bloomed into arrests before a sword was ever drawn. Picture a winter evening when the king's privy chamber flickers with firelight. A small circle of advisors lean over maps and dispatches their faces pinched in the glow of melting tallow. They speak of France of Scotland, of traitors who gather under foreign coats of arms. One advisor, gray-bearded and hoarse from too many cold nights, leans closer to the king's fevered ear, promising loyalty while slipping his own name free of suspicion. It's a curious detail that one of Henry's last trusted spies was a servant boy, too plain to notice a lad who carried sealed notes in the soles of his shoes. Some say the boy betrayed a dozen secret meetings by listening through keyholes before he was paid off and vanished into the city's muddy streets, never seen again. Scholars remain puzzled by how a ruler so suspicious still left cracks for secrets to slip through. But power has a way of breeding blind spots, especially when your eyes see threats in every shadow, except the one standing at your elbow. You pass into the candlelit chamber, where a letter rests ink still damp. It names a cousin, a noble, perhaps a queen's lady-in-waiting, anyone whose family crest might threaten the Tudor rose if planted in the wrong soil. This single parchment can destroy a lineage or rescue the king's peace of mind for another restless night. The quill scratches again, sealing a fate in wax stamped with a lion's snarl. Outside, under the palace, eaves a few muffled footsteps break the frost on cobblestones. A whispered name and exchanged coin, proof that some conspiracies never see daylight, but burrow deep under layers of courtiers' smiles and servants' nods. One odd record tucked in a tower guard's ledger notes how late in his reign Henry ordered random inspections of the kitchens and wine cellars, at night convinced poison might find him between mouthfuls of roast boar or mulled claret. In these last years, the king's nights are crowded with half-seen threats. Sometimes a flicker of betrayal is enough to drag a noble from silk sheets to a freezing cell before dawn. Other times, an innocent word at supper blooms into an accusation by sunrise. Some scholars remain divided on whether these purges protected the crown or simply choked it with fear until no one dared speak plain truth to a king who trusted shadows more than men. Listen carefully as you drift past the great hall where guards warm stiff hands by dying braziers. Overhead, banners embroidered with golden lions and red roses hang limp in the still air. Beneath them, alliances shift like sand. Old friends become suspects. New favorites vanish as quickly as they rose. Each candle guttering out in its iron sconce feels like another secret snuffed before it can leap to life. Yet through it all, the conspiracies breathe on small flickers of rebellion under a crown grown heavy with paranoia. And you wandering these halls tonight feel how the pulse of betrayal quickens with every creak of oak doors, every shuffle of feet in the dark. Somewhere a plot stirs again, half-formed, half-feared, waiting for a king too weary to see it coming. Step deeper now into the chill corridors, where the king's shadow stretches longer than his trust ever could. The crown, once a glittering promise of triumph, has become a cloak of paranoia that wraps tighter each year around Henry's aging frame. It is here, in the hush between footsteps and the faint rustle of parchment, that fear becomes law, etched into decrees that drip ink like blood. You follow him as he limps down the gallery lined with portraits, ghostly likenesses of wives and foes alike, their painted eyes tracking every secret thought he never says aloud. Courtiers bow as he passes their heads low, their own secrets pressed flat beneath velvet caps and forced smiles. Behind them, the gossip flows quieter than the winter wind. Who will be next to fall? Who dares speak when silence is safer than truth? Historians still debate whether Henry's late cruelty was calculated or simply the last defense of a king cornered by shadows of his own making. Each new law stiffens the walls around him. Each execution sweeps away another voice that might whisper disloyalty over a cup of wine. Some say he wrote these edicts himself, hunched over parchment, long after the palace slept, candle guttering beside ink-stained fingers. A curious detail, the king's own guards were sometimes made to sign loyalty oaths twice in the same month, proof that trust once frayed can never be mended by parchment alone. Those who guarded his bedchamber carried not just halberds, but a terror that their nod or yawn might be mistaken for betrayal. Walk now through the council chamber. You'll find scribes bent over tables stacked with warrants and lists of names. Some will vanish into the tower before moonrise. Some will buy their freedom with bribes so heavy they break family estates in a single night. One small rumor survives in the diaries of a scribe. He swore the king once crossed out a name in silence, only to add it again by dawn, convinced the man's smile at supper hid a traitor's blade. You stand at the edge of these growing shadows and feel how fear weaves through stone halls and feathered quills alike. The king's cloak of paranoia spreads its folds over nobles who once feasted beside him, over ministers who once held his hunting spears. Now they hold their tongues, instead, praying the next rumor skips their name. Some scholars remain puzzled by how Henry, once celebrated for his charm and dazzling presence, grew into this fortress of suspicion. Perhaps the ulcers in his leg were mirrored by wounds in his mind, each betrayal, each lost heir, each wife's last breath, cutting deeper than any blade drawn in battle. Or perhaps they say this was the true face of kingship, unmasked only when the revelry fades and the bedchamber grows too silent for comfort. Outside, you hear the muffled crack of frost under a guard's boot, the quiet scrape of a dagger checked beneath a sleeve. Somewhere in a stone cell below, a noble counts the hours to don his only crime, a jest made at the wrong banquet, or an ancestor who once dared claim a drop of royal blood. One odd fact that lingers: the palace's doorways were sometimes fitted with extra locks in these last years, not to keep danger out, but to keep secrets in. It's said the king ordered hidden passages blocked, fearful that spies might slip through them under moonlight, while he lay half dreaming of daggers behind the bed curtains. So you stand here in this hush between torchlight and rumor, feeling how the crown's weight presses not just on Henry's brow, but on every trembling subject within these walls. A fear so thick you could bottle it, if only it wouldn't bite back when uncorked. And above it all, the king's footsteps echo steady, but slow, a reminder that sometimes the cruelest prisons are the ones we weave for ourselves, thread by thread, decree by decree. Drift now beyond the council chamber and down the private corridors that wind behind the throne room's grandeur passages, where torchlight flickers over stone walls steeped in a stench no perfume can hide. Here behind closed doors gilded with Tudor roses, the king's courtiers gather in stiff knots, eyes, downcast nostrils pinched, as if a single breath might betray what they truly smell, the slow rot of a monarch decaying from within. You stand with them in this uneasy hush. Servants tiptoe past, carrying linen bundles, stained dark, the sharp bite of vinegar and rose water trailing behind. Apothecaries pass bowls of thick ointment hand to hand, their shadows flickering on walls that once echoed with feasts and flirtation, but now hum with dread. Some scholars remain divided over just how bad the king's condition truly smelled. Letters hint at windows thrown open, even in winter, incense burned day and night, and courtiers who feigned colds just to hold scented cloths to their faces without offense. One curious detail lingers in an old steward's account. At the height of his ulcer's worst days, Henry ordered extra tapestries hung near his chair, as if the heavy velvet could muffle not just sound, but the scent that warned the court how quickly the flesh beneath their king's silks was betraying him. Historians still debate whether the king himself grasped how fully his stench whispered truths his courtiers dared not speak aloud. To England's people, Henry remained the fierce lion on his coinage, robust, thunderous, immortal. But behind palace walls, rumor spread like rot. Through linen bandages, the king's leg oozed through layers of silk hose, leaving stains on cushions that had once cradled only regal splendor. You drift closer, Now imagine the low groans that slip from his throat when servants gently peel away dressings hardened to the wound beneath. The royal surgeons work by candlelight, scraping dead flesh with blades cleaned more by prayer than by science. Some say the king bore this pain with a knight's resolve. Others claim he cursed his healers so viciously that even the bravest physician flinched from the next cut. One peculiar rumor, it was whispered, that Henry's personal barber, tasked with trimming the king's beard and hair, sometimes doubled as an unofficial wound dresser. His hands, so skilled at shears, learned to unpeel rank linen and dab at pus with lavender-scented cloths. Some scholars find it almost poetic, one blade shaving royal whiskers, another scraping life's final decay. Step back and see the courtiers standing near enough to glimpse, but never so near they cannot deny. They master the art of silent gagging polite coughs hidden behind lace kerchiefs. Some pray the king's leg will heal. Others pray the stench will never reach their own names, scribbled on royal decrees for closer service. These chambers, once alive with music and flirtation, grow quieter now. The same walls that heard the laughter of queens and the clink of feasting goblets now catch only the muted sob of an exhausted page or the shuffle of servants scrubbing rushes soaked with the king's secret torment. Some say this is the moment when power itself turns sour, when the ruler's body, so often used to dazzle and dominate, becomes the one thing he cannot control. Historians still argue whether the smell of that rotting flesh did more to drain loyalty than any failed treaty or broken vow. Perhaps they say the reek drifting from beneath royal robes told the court more honestly than any proclamation that the Tudor sun was setting fast, and that no silk drapery or golden scepter could disguise a kingdom rotting from within one sore at a time. Tonight, as you drift behind the velvet curtains, you feel it too, that quiet truth, breathing under layers of perfume and fear. A king's crown may dazzle the eye, but the stench that curls beneath it speaks louder than any herald's trumpet ever could. Follow now into the quietest chamber of all, where the king's once booming voice shrinks to ragged whispers. Here, at the edge of breath and power, loyal servants linger like ghosts themselves, nursing a monarch who drifts in and out of a sleep too shallow to bring true rest. It is in these final days that the weight of Henry's crown seems heavier than ever, pressing him deep into a bed he once commanded like a throne. You stand by the heavy oak bedpost now. The tapestries on the walls have grown dull with candle soot. The rushes on the floor replaced twice daily to hide the damp that leaks from bandaged legs. Nearby, a fire sputters against the winter chill, but it cannot warm the king's pallid skin or the cold dread that clings to every servant's bowed head. Some historians still debate who truly stayed beside him in these last hours, whose loyalty outlasted ambition, whose prayers were whispered even as they wondered when the next ruler would rise. There's a curious detail in one chamberlain's scribbled notes sometimes. When Henry's breathing grew ragged, he would startle awake and demand a mirror, only to push it away with a hoarse laugh once he saw the ruin staring back at him. Other times, they say he would call for his armor to be brought to his bedside, as if the sight of steel might shore up a spirit rusting faster than any blade. You drift closer. A gentle cough rattles through the hush. The royal physician leans in, holding his breath against the rank sweetness of infected wounds. He murmurs comforts Henry barely hears. Some say the king spoke of battles long past, of jousts won, and enemies unseated his mind, wandering back to fields where the cheers of thousands made him feel immortal, even as his flesh now rebels. with every heartbeat. A few loyal men remain kneeling near the foot of the bed, scribes, priests, old friends who survived the tower and the axe. Their faces glow yellow in the candlelight as they watch their sovereign slip between dreams and the rasp of half-formed commands. Historians still argue whether these final murmurs were coherent. Some claim he asked after his son, Edward, barely a boy, the fragile heir, whose tiny shoulders must soon carry this heavy crown. Others say he spoke no words at all, only half-breathed curses at shadows flickering behind the curtains. A nurse smooths the linen at his brow. Somewhere in the chamber, a candle gutters out. The hush that follows is more unsettling than any courtly intrigue. Power so thunderous, when wielded by the young prince who once smashed lances in the tilt yard, now leaks away with each labored breath. You catch a small, odd truth buried in an old ambassador's dispatch. In these final nights, the king sometimes asked that music be played just beyond the chamber door, soft lutes and quiet voices humming old church hymns. Some scholars wonder if this was his way of silencing the darker murmurs that crawled through his mind. A man who shattered Rome's hold on England, now soothed to sleep by songs older than his own, break with faith. Step closer, feel the heat slip away under the covers as a loyal page shifts the heavy fur blanket higher up the king's chest. Even the grand canopy bed, carved with Tudor roses and royal crests, seems too vast now for the shrinking body that lies within it. A once mighty lion sinking deeper into shadows as the crown beside him gleams cold in the candlelight. Outside, the palace holds its breath. Servants shuffle past, with heads bowed, pretending not to hear the ragged wheeze drifting through the crack beneath the door. And you, standing watch from the corner, sense what they do. This realm's roar is now no more than a whisper, a final fragile exhale waiting to drift into history's hush. Slip into the hush that clings to the king's bedside like a final cloak, thick, heavy, expectant. This is the chamber where last words are born, or perhaps invented by those left behind to shape legends out of silence. Here, at the ragged edge of Henry's breath, the palace listens for something profound to stitch into the chronicles a final confession, a warning, a blessing for the fragile boy who will soon wear the crown. You stand among the silhouettes that hover near the bed, priests murmuring prayers over cracked lips, scribes poised with ink and trembling parchment, hoping for words worth recording in the vaults of royal memory. Some historians still argue whether Henry spoke at all in those final moments, whether he summoned enough voice to shape a phrase that would echo across centuries. Some say he whispered Edward's name. Others claim he spat curses at the ghost of Anne Boleyn. And a few suggest there was nothing, only the slow rasp of air slipping through cracked teeth, no more royal than the dying sigh of any common man. There's a curious fragment tucked into an old bishop's letters. He noted that a draft through the chamber windows blew out 3 candles at once, just as the king's breathing hitched. The servants froze, 3 flames gone, as if the Holy Trinity itself had marked the passing of England's greatest tyrant and most fragile man. Or so the bishop wrote, shading faith and politics in the same line of ink. Lean closer now. You see the king's eyes flutter open cloudy, and rimmed with tears, the court pretends not to notice. A ring clatters from swollen fingers to the rushes below gold against straw, the quietest rebellion his failing body can muster. Some say he tried to reach for it, but the hand fell limp halfway to the floor. Beside the bed, a priest presses a crucifix into his palm whispering Latin benedictions older than the crown itself. Somewhere in that tangle of holy words and soft sobs from a kneeling servant, the air shifts. Did he murmur a plea for forgiveness? Or did he drift into memories of green tilt yards, of feasts that masked loneliness of queens who wept into pillows behind locked doors? One soft rumor survives from the page who claimed to be closest at that final exhale. He said the king's last breath smelled faintly of wine and cloves, the same sweet blend that once hid the stench of rotting wounds. Historians still disagree. Was that clove scent real, or just the page's way of painting something gentle over a truth too rancid for history's tidy pages? Outside the chamber, the palace holds its collective breath. Courtiers shuffle in satin slippers down long corridors, eyes darting at each other with the same unspoken question. Is he gone? Is it done? Beyond the frost-glazed windows, church bells wait to toll, but do not yet dare break the hush. It is here, in this candlelit purgatory, that the myth begins to stretch its arms. Some will say he died a tyrant, bloated raging at a god he defied yet feared to meet. Others will paint him as the Lion King to the end, defiant cunning unbowed. And you, drifting at the foot of the bed, know the truth. Lies somewhere, in the rasp between those final breaths, a ruler stripped bare of armor and decree, just a man with ulcers and regrets, and a crown that glitters in the dark, too heavy now for any mortal neck. So listen for that last ghost of air, the quietest decree ever uttered in these gilded halls. Whether it carried a name, a curse, or nothing at all, it sealed an era with the softest of signatures, a breath, a hush, a silence, waiting for England to wake and wonder what comes next. Follow the hush as it seeps from the royal bedchamber into the cold dawn, winding through stone passageways where servants slip by, like shadows' eyes, lowered to hide relief grief or careful indifference. Here begins the slow, creaking ceremony that sends a king from velvet sheets to a tomb lined with secrets. A funeral, some say, is the final stage play, its script half written by tradition, half whispered by those who survived to shape the tale. You stand now among black-clad courtiers gathered in the great hall, their breath clouding in the chill as they watch carpenters hammer the last iron nails into a coffin, too heavy for any single man to lift. Historians still debate how many truly mourned. Some wept into lace handkerchiefs, heads bowed not for the king, but for the pieces of their own fortunes that died with him. Others rehearsed subtle nods and smiles behind gloved hands, already aligning themselves with the next sun to rise over England's fragile throne. A curious note from a French envoy hints at the smell that clung to the king's body, even in death, sweet herbs packed into the casket to mask the stench that still whispered of the rotting wounds hidden beneath yards of silk and a gilded crown laid carefully atop cold brows. Some say the embalming took days longer than expected, servants fanning the air to keep courtiers from fainting, while priests muttered prayers louder than usual to drown the quiet retch of the men who bore witness. Step closer to the bier, now draped in deep crimson and edged in gold thread. 6 black horses stand ready outside their breath, steaming in the icy air as they stamp and snort beneath embroidered funeral trappings. The coffin, massive, unwieldy, must be rolled slowly through corridors too narrow for grandeur, its passage scraping centuries of secrets from the palace walls. You drift beside it, listening to the soft tap of iron wheels on stone as the cortege gathers in the courtyard. A hush falls when the coffin emerges, a hush so total that for a heartbeat you could almost believe the king's ghost lingers, measuring each bow and whispered vow. Some scholars remain puzzled by the final route his body took, why it paused at certain chapels, why it avoided certain gates rumored to creak too loudly with unspoken sins. An odd rumor clings to this royal procession as the hearse rolled through a winter dawn toward Windsor. The lead horses balked near a village cross. Some swear it was the cold. Others claim the wind carried a stench that made beasts shudder, forcing stable hands to coax them forward with spiced cloths pressed over flaring nostrils. Whether true or not, the story lingered one final humiliation for a king who once thundered across England on war horses draped in silk and gold. Along the road, commoners gather in clumps, hats pressed to chests, eyes downcast. Some mourn. Others wonder if the next crown will weigh lighter on their taxes or heavier on their children's backs. A few women press sprigs of rosemary and rue into the wagon's path, a soft wish for peace, for mercy, for the ending of a reign that devoured heads and gold in equal measure. Historians still argue whether Henry's funeral was grander than it needed to be, a desperate last performance for a king who once believed splendor could hush suspicion. But you trailing this slow procession through frost-crusted lanes and villages that barely whisper his name, see the truth slip through the gilt and black silk. The body inside the rolling casket is not a lion anymore. It is a husk wrapped in velvet, and rumor carried toward a tomb that promises secrets will stay buried even when the air still tastes faintly of decay. So follow the cortege now, step by creaking step, as England's courtiers hold their breath, half grieving, half calculating, while the crown hovers just ahead on a boy king's brow, waiting to be tested by storms still gathering beyond the next bend in the road. Trail the final steps behind the cortege now, as it creaks through Windsor's heavy gates, iron-bound, weather-darkened, older than any Tudor claim to England's crown. The wheels grind against frost-hardened ruts, groaning under the coffin's weight, the horses' breath steaming like ghosts that refuse to drift too far from the king they once bore in triumph. In this hush, the realm's last glimpse of Henry is wrapped in black velvet, and rumors no sermon can wholly bury. Inside St. George's Chapel, the air is sharp with candle smoke, and the cold breath of stone walls that have heard countless vows and confessions whispered into ancient shadows. You stand at the edge of a gathering of nobles, bishops, and pale-faced pages who shift uneasily as the coffin passes its iron fittings, catching sparks of torchlight. Some kneel with eyes lowered, lips moving in half-hearted prayers. Others keep one eye open, counting who bows deepest and who dares glance at the boy king, waiting to inherit this uneasy hush. Historians still debate how many truths were laid to rest alongside Henry, whether secrets wrapped in those final linen sheets might have changed the kingdom's course had they slipped free beneath the chapel's vaulted ribs. Some say the marble tomb concealed not only a king's bones, but whispers about heirs' hidden affairs, unspeakable alliances stitched together with blood and threat. Yet there they lie locked beneath a slab, engraved with roses and lions, an eternal hush bought with gold and fear. A curious detail lingers in an old clerk's record. As pallbearers lowered the coffin, a draft blew through the chapel's high windows, guttering a dozen candles in one breath. Some took it for a sign, a final scornful joke from the old king, mocking those who prayed he'd sleep quietly. Others claimed it was only the winter wind sneaking past crumbling mortar. Still, the story clung to Windsor's walls, retold by choir boys in whispers, long after the crown passed, to hands too small to hold its true weight. Step closer to the carved tomb now. The bishop's Latin chant coils around the stone, a solemn promise of eternal rest that never quite muffles the scrape of boots shifting on cold flagstones. You notice the faces in the gathered court. Some glisten with real tears, others with carefully staged sorrow that will wash away as soon as the final hymn fades. One queen lies beneath this same roof. Two daughters will carry pieces of him in their blood long after the candles are snuffed tonight. Some scholars remain puzzled by how these daughters would each bend the realm in their own fierce image, rewriting the legacy of a father who left England richer in scandal than in gold. Outside peasants stand under gray skies, breath misting as they guess what tomorrow's dawn will bring. Will the taxes lighten? Will new wars follow old grudges? Does the king's ghost linger in the keep's drafty halls? Or does he sink quiet at last, crown traded for silence he never mastered in life? You drift now to the chapel door as the final prayers echo off ancient stone. The coffin lies still beneath layers of velvet iron nails, and the weight of history that refuses to settle as easily as dust. A single candle trembles in the chancel arch, its flame flickering in the same breath that once roared from a king's throat to break a church, a marriage, 1,000 loyal vows. Historians still wonder if his legacy is a tale of triumph or caution, a warning whispered in the hush between footsteps on old stone. Tonight you stand where the echoes fade, and the hush grows deeper than any oath. The lion's roar lies coiled under marble, now a secret the realm tiptoes around, whenever it dares remember how power can rot even the mightiest flesh. Sleep lingers at the edge of these stones. Let the hush close in. Yet just beyond this hush, another echo stirs, where the marble silence gives way to the rustle of glass vials and secrets that never truly slept. In the shadowed corridors of the Tudor court, you'd hear the clink of glass vials before you'd see the apothecary's stooped figure. Dried mandrake root-powdered pearls, ground-up beetles from Egypt, everything stuffed into tiny wooden chests lined with velvet and secrets. Somewhere a boy runs errands, clutching a slip of parchment scrawled with ingredients he can't pronounce. If you press your ear to a door, you might catch the gentle fizz of a potion brewing over a slow flame. Why these exotic herbs? Why trust a foreign powder more than your own soil's simples? Some say the king believed a rare spice carried the power of distant kingdoms in a single pinch. Others suspect the foreignness itself made the potion feel mystical, untouchable by common ailments. You slip through a half-open door behind the main hall. Inside, it's surprisingly cold for a room stuffed with so many simmering brews. Shelves bow under the weight of glass bottles corked tight with lumps of beeswax. The labels are handwritten Latin mixed with scribbles only the apothecary can read. Somewhere, a mortar sits mid-grind, its pestle crusted in something dark green. One brew steams in a small copper pot, releasing a smell so sharp you'd swear it could peel the skin off garlic. A flicker of candlelight reveals bundles of herbs hanging upside down. Some leaves look ordinary, sage lavender, a twist of rosemary. But others are unrecognizable, smuggled from ports, with names that slip through your mind like mist. You wonder if half of these ingredients truly do anything at all. Historians still argue whether Tudor healers genuinely understood the potency of what they mixed, or if faith alone turned a spoonful of powder into hope. You'd expect a royal apothecary to be grand, with polished marble counters and spotless jars. But here, a sticky layer of residue clings to every work table. In the corners, tiny clay pots hold oil infusions turning rancid. You catch a glimpse of an old stained ledger payments recorded in hurried ink. Each line a reminder all this expense for a cure that might not work. There's a rumor that one apothecary mixed his potions stronger at night when no eyes watched. A sprinkle more of rare cinnamon, a drop extra of rose oil stolen from a queen's bath supply. Some patients swore they felt the difference, though. Whether it was real or imagined is a question scholars keep turning over centuries later. A rat scuttles across the far wall, unconcerned by these royal elixirs. If the king only knew that his priceless potions sometimes cooled next to rodent tracks. You can almost imagine a sly courtier slipping in at dawn, trading a secret recipe for a pouch of gold, vanishing before anyone questions the powder's origin. You linger by the heavy wooden chest in the corner. Its lid is cracked, and inside cloth bundles hide shapes that could be rare roots or just more illusions. The smell of camphor and vinegar curls in your nose. The air tastes faintly metallic, like a promise and a threat all at once. It's said Henry VIII trusted these potions more than his physicians, at times convinced that foreign secrets in a vial could patch his failing health. Some scholars whisper that this blind trust let frauds thrive in the shadows, selling miracles that rotted teeth faster than they cured fevers. But when the pain is royal, and the stakes are a crown who wouldn't gamble on a powder that might buy another sunrise, you back away from the chest, letting the shadows close again. There will be more secrets ahead, veins to drain teeth to pull poisons to ponder. But for now, you drift past the shelves of quiet glass, listening for the next whisper behind Tudor doors. A hush falls as you drift from the apothecary's lair to a dim corridor where whispers slip through stone walls thicker than any secret. Hear the battle between learned physicians and wise women bruise like a potion no king can contain. In the flickering torchlight, you see the men in stiff collars, velvet caps balanced over balding crowns, clutching their Latin texts like shields. They claim the right to heal the king's gout, his ulcers, his endless fevers. But behind hedgerows and cottage doors, another league of healers stirs their own remedies. Midwives, herb women, cunning folk, whose hands know the shape of a fevered brow as well as any court-trained hand. If you stand by the palace gates at dawn, you might glimpse one such woman, her basket brimming with dock leaves, poppy heads, and tiny roots dug by moonlight. She'll bow low if questioned, speaking in riddles, yet everyone knows that sometimes the queen's chambermaids slip her silver for secrets. Once inside the king's chambers, however, these women become ghosts, spoken of only when blame must be laid. Should a poultice fail, should a birth go wrong, the king's physicians point outward witchcraft, superstition, quackery. And yet the same healers sometimes steal recipes whispered from village firesides. Historians still debate whether the learned men's cures were truly more effective or simply more acceptable when penned in Latin and sealed with a royal stamp. In this quiet war, a single sprig of feverfew might spark suspicion. A wise woman's knowledge passed mother to daughter was never written down. Her cure was memory whispered before dawn, hidden beneath layers of petticoats. Some say these women brewed secrets older than the crown itself. Your feet carry you down a side hall, where a heated argument echoes one voice, clipped and cold, the other warm, with the round vowels of the countryside. A physician insists on mercury purges and bleeding. The midwife counters with tansy tea and prayers to Saint Agatha. Between them lies the king's fragile body, stretched on embroidered sheets, sweating out a fever no man or woman fully understands. Rumors cling to these corridors, like damp a wise woman accused of cursing a royal birth. A physician bribed to discredit her with false testimony. And yet, when all else failed, when the king's pulse thudded like a muffled drum, who did the palace servants slip past the guards? The same midwife the court claimed to scorn. You pause by a small window slit, breathing in the scent of crushed mint from a basket left behind. For a moment you wonder, was it safer to trust the man in silk robes quoting Galen, or the old woman with dirt under her nails, humming lullabies to restless infants? Some scholars argue the king's survival hung equally on both the learned cure and the folk cure the bleeding bowl and the bundle of dried marjoram under the pillow. In the flickering dark, you imagine how it must feel to stand in a candlelit chamber, staring down a fevered monarch, while men in gold chains mutter that your hands are unclean. To know that if your brew works, you might be praised in whispers, yet if it fails, your fate could swing by a rope at dawn. Tonight, no one dares breathe that truth aloud. Instead, the physicians gather in velvet clusters, arguing dosages and Latin incantations. The wise women slip through servants' doors, leaving sachets of herbs tucked in secret places. The king dreams caught between the battles of knowledge and superstition, his cure, a prize neither side is willing to surrender. As you pull away from the shadows, the debate fades, but its echo follows you, a soft reminder that healing in Tudor times was as much about power as poultices. Somewhere ahead, silver bowls await their dawn offering. You step lightly. The next chamber holds veins to drain. A single candle, guttering near an open window, greets you as you slip into the king's private chamber. Here dawn does not break with birdsong, but with the soft clatter of silver bowls waiting to be stained red. You pause at the threshold, your breath catching, at the sight a royal body prepared for ritual bleeding veins, ready to weep into polished metal before a single morsel of bread is touched. You'd think the first meal of a king would be rich roasted meats, honeyed figs, a goblet of claret. But in these Tudor mornings, the king's day begins not with nourishment, but with subtraction. Bloodletting, the ancient balancing act, where physicians swore that a careful cut could drain away a night's excesses, bad humors, or a lurking fever before it bloomed. Some scholars still puzzle over just how much good it did. Was it cure or custom medicine or theater staged to prove the physician's worth? Near the bed, a barber surgeon bows low razor, gleaming in the flickering light. His apron is spotless now, but a closer look shows faint, rusty stains where steel has kissed flesh before. On the bed, the king's wrist is tied with a silk ribbon. A small brass bowl sits on a side table, half filled with warm water to soften the skin. A linen cloth waits to stanch the flow once the prescribed ounces have fled the royal veins. You shift closer, careful not to rustle the heavy curtains that frame this hushed performance. There is something oddly tender about it, how the surgeon murmurs soothing nothings as the blade kisses skin, how an attendant stands ready with a goblet of spiced wine to ease the sting. You wonder if the king eyes, half closed in the chill dawn, ever questioned the wisdom of spilling his lifeblood before breakfast. A single drop darkens the rim of the silver bowl, then another, then a soft patter like rain against tin. If you close your eyes, you might believe it's just a morning drizzle tapping on a palace roof. But here, each drop is a prayer for balance. Too much blood, too much heat, too much bile, such things must be tamed. Historians still debate whether these dawn bleedings did more to calm the royal mind than the royal body. Near the foot of the bed, A page boy hovers cloth in hand, ready to wipe stray droplets. He's trying not to stare too hard at the rich red pooling in the bowl. To spill royal blood by accident more than the doctor ordered would be a disaster whispered about for generations. And so every cut is measured, every ounce weighed, as if the king's life were a scale tipping between life and ruin. There are records of Henry VIII submitting to this ritual dozens of times in a single year, sometimes to calm a fever, sometimes to quell his temper, sometimes simply because his physicians had no better idea. Some accounts even claim he demanded bleedings before certain feasts, believing a lighter body made for a sharper mind. Whether this worked or merely weakened him remains an argument that drifts through scholars' papers centuries later. Outside the window, the sky shifts from deep indigo to a paler gray. The candle gutters one last time before snuffing itself out, smoke curling upward like a final offering. The surgeon wipes his blade on a strip of linen, folds it neatly into his leather case, and backs away with a bow so low you fear he might vanish into the rushes underfoot. The king's arm is bandaged, the bowl half full, the wine cup empty. Breakfast waits in another room. Thin gruel, sweetened almonds, perhaps a swallow of mead if the morning's bleeding hasn't left him too dizzy to stand. As you drift from the chamber, the hush lingers behind you, a dawn ritual more intimate than any prayer, a quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest cure Tudor medicine could offer was simply to take something away. Ahead, another remedy waits, leeches and purges that promise more than they deliver. You step softly into the next shadow. Past the dawn bowls and quiet razors, you slip into a smaller room where the windows are shuttered tight against the rising sun. Here, the cure takes another shape, slippery, slow, and greedier than any surgeon's blade. Leeches wait in shallow clay pots, squirming under damp moss, hungry for royal blood that no silver bowl could ever hold enough of. You pause at the threshold, nose wrinkling at the earthy smell, a swamp trapped in a box, a tiny pond pressed into palace service. An attendant lifts one, its glistening body curling around his gloved fingers, as he murmurs about balance and humors and excess heat. Once leeches were the pride of medieval medicine, believed to know which corrupted fluid to draw, which hidden fever to drink away. Some scholars still question whether these wriggling healers did much beyond leaving puckered wounds and dark bruises as evidence that anything was being done. In the center of the room, a padded chair waits. Henry VIII himself would sit here, a king perched like any commoner on a wooden seat, sleeves rolled high, while slimy mouths found tender skin. Records say he endured this spectacle so often his courtiers grew accustomed to the sight, his pale arm dotted with tiny ringed shadows, where the leeches had feasted and fallen off fat and content. You drift closer, peering into another jar. Inside, more of the creatures swirl in sluggish circles. A servant mutters about imported stock. These leeches come from far-off marshes, rumored to be stronger, hungrier, more effective than the native kind. Historians argue whether this was true or just another Tudor superstition, but the ledgers don't lie. Merchants grew rich, peddling foreign leeches to desperate kings. A soft groan breaks your thoughts. Near the hearth, a second cure is prepared, the purge. Unlike the silent work of leeches, purging is a noisy affair, an assault on the royal stomach meant to flush the system of whatever invisible poison lurked inside. Pitchers of bitter herbs stand ready, mashed into slurries with wine or vinegar, sometimes laced with powdered rhubarb or saltpeter. One story claims Henry once endured 3 purges in a single night, each more violent than the last. Court records note the chaos delicately. His Majesty suffered evacuations. They write a polite way to say the king spent hours doubled over, clutching his belly, while servants prayed the cure wouldn't kill him before the sickness did. Some say this endless draining blood bile, sweat tears left the king's body weaker than the illness ever could. Others defend the practice, pointing out that medicine was as much ritual as science. If the king believed the leeches drank away his fever, perhaps belief alone carried him another day. Historians still pore over the accounts, trying to measure where trust ended and damage began. In a corner, a young page holds a damp cloth to his nose, trying not to gag at the smell of bitter herbs simmering in a brass pot. An older servant wipes the chair clean, as if preparing it for the next round. In this hush, the king is just a man fragile flushed, convinced that balance is a matter of ounces drawn out and fluids forced through. You brush your fingers along a shelf lined with jars, tiny brown glass filled with strange powders, ground coral-dried violet petals, flakes of gold leaf. Some will coat the tongue before a purge. Others will be stirred into wine to settle the stomach once the storm is over. Whether they soothed or stung is lost to time, though records hint more than one royal patient refused a second dose. As you slip from the room, the hush closes behind you like a sigh. Ahead, other secrets, bruised spices, crossing oceans, powders hidden in cloaks, all whispering of cures the palace physicians could not craft alone. You step forward. Venice waits in the shadows. You leave the squirming leeches and bitter slurries behind, stepping into a chamber where the air smells sweeter, if only at first breath. Here the hush of Tudor medicine mingles with foreign winds, for in this room the king's healers keep their most whispered secret, a quiet trade route that stretches from the damp alleys of London all the way to the spice-scented docks of Venice. A single crate sits cracked open on the floor, straw spilling out to reveal tiny glass vials nestled like precious gems. Some hold ground cinnamon so fine it clings to your fingertips. Others shimmer with powders the color of desert sand musk, camphor, even a pinch of myrrh. If you lift a vial to the light, tiny flecks dance like motes of gold. These are no ordinary seasonings for a royal feast. These are medicine, or at least that's what the palace whispers promise. A flicker of candlelight shows an apothecary bent low over a ledger. His quill scratches numbers, foreign names, coded marks meant to confuse prying eyes. Venice, after all, does not freely share its secrets. Merchants risk their necks and fortunes to slip these spices past watchful port inspectors. Some scholars argue this hush-hush trade was the backbone of early modern court medicine, exotic cures, that more often than not cured nothing at all but filled pockets and soothed anxious kings with the taste of faraway lands. Near the fireplace, a brazier glows, warming a small copper pan. A pinch of imported resin melts into a thin, fragrant smoke. The apothecary claims it clears the lungs wards off fevers. Others suspect it masks the stench of royal ailments that no rosewater can hide. You lean closer and catch the bittersweet scent of frankincense, mingled with a sharper note, perhaps clove oil, smuggled from the East Indies and worth a noble's ransom in the London markets. A hush spreads when a courier slips in cloak, still damp from a night crossing the channel. He carries a cloth bundle heavy in his hands, sealed with a wax stamp bearing a merchant's crest. Inside could be anything dried ginseng, a powder made from crushed pearls, maybe even an illegal substance banned yet welcomed behind royal doors when desperation grows thick. It's said Henry's court was addicted to the idea of distant cures. If a local route failed, perhaps a foreign one held salvation. Historians still puzzle over invoices that list items more fitting for a perfumer than a physician. Rose attar, from Damascus nutmeg, from the Banda Islands, saffron pressed into tiny parchment packets. Some was sprinkled in the king's mulled wine, some mixed into salves, rubbed onto infected wounds. Whether these imports healed or merely perfumed the air is lost to the candle smoke of the archives. A small wooden chest near the hearth rattles when nudged. You lift the lid just enough to spy tiny glass phials wrapped in silk. Labels scrawled in crooked Italian hint at Secrets Polvere di Drago dragon powder, perhaps just another name for powdered rhino horn, a superstition older than the kingdom itself. One rumor claims that when the king's fever soared beyond the reach of local herbs, his physicians mixed this so-called dragon powder into a wine so bitter even he winced at the taste. Did it help? Records disagree. Some say he rose stronger, others that he slipped deeper into delirium, while the merchants counted fresh coin. In a dark corner, a whisper floats. What if these exotic powders were not only cures, but poisons? A convenient blend that might ease a cough or end a rain. Some scholars remain convinced that a pinch too strong, a draught too heavy, could shift the course of a crown. Yet no proof survives, only rumors, scribbled notes, and the cold silence of sealed vaults. You stand breathing in the mingled scents, sweet resin, sharp spice, a promise of health that drifts on foreign winds, but leaves behind a trail of secrets. Ahead, sharper tools await, where imported powder gives way to iron forceps ready to pry pain from royal gums. You step lightly. The tooth puller's shadow flickers near. A hush lingers in the spice-laden air as you slip from secret powders to a darker corner of the palace where no sweet resin can mask the sharp edge of pain. Here waits the royal tooth puller, a man whose tools gleam sharper than any blade, and whose presence alone makes courtiers flinch behind velvet drapes. In this dim chamber, you find a single wooden chair, its arms scarred by nervous hands. A small table stands beside it, lined with implements laid out on a stained linen cloth. Iron forceps catch the candlelight, a cruel gleam that promises relief by force. Nearby rests a mallet, a slender chisel, and thin splints of wood to wedge a royal mouth open, should the king's jaw clench too tight against the agony to come. You lean closer to the table, noting how the tools vary in shape and size, some with curved jaws for back molars, others narrow and fine for delicate front teeth. A flask of rose water sits at the edge, meant not to sterilize, for what did the Tudors know of such things, but to freshen breath or wash away blood when the deed is done. Historians still debate whether these extractions did more harm than good, pulling infection from the root, yes, but also ripping nerves raw, inviting fevers that no Venetian powder could cure. A story lingers in the court's darker gossip, Henry himself plagued by an abscess so foul that the court avoided his presence for weeks, summoned the tooth puller by candlelight. No ceremony, no grand ritual, just the king in a robe, sweat beading on his brow as the iron jaws closed around a rotting tooth. Some say the forceps slipped once, cracking bone where it shouldn't have. Others whisper that the king, so mighty, before his nobles, bit down on a leather strap like any common man when the final wrench came. Near the hearth, a basin of warm vinegar steams gently. It's said this rinse could dull pain or clean a wound. More likely, it only disguised the taste of iron and blood for a fleeting moment. You can almost hear the soft mutter of the tooth puller gentle lies to soothe a trembling royal. Only a pinch, your majesty. Only a heartbeat. Then the sickening crack that echoes down stone corridors long after the tooth is dropped into a ragged pouch. You glance at the chair again and imagine the hush that follows. The royal head slumps back. An attendant wipes sweat from a pale brow. A page collects the tooth still warm and tosses it into the hearth where bone turns to ash alongside every unspoken fear of infection. Some scholars wonder if this primitive dentistry saved more lives than it cost one tooth might fester into a mortal wound if left too long. Yet more than one Tudor king carried scars in their jawline that no crown could cover. On the shelf above the hearth, a box holds clove buds and dried mint spices crushed and packed into cavities to numb the pain. A faint sweetness drifts through the chamber, mingling with the coppery tang that clings to every tool. You imagine the next patient, perhaps a queen's maid or a young prince with milk teeth gone black too soon, stepping into this hush with dread in every breath. In the hall outside, the court pretends not to listen. They murmur about treaties, taxes, heirs, anything but the muffled groan that slips past the thick oak door. It's said that when a king's mouth fails, so does his command. A strong voice lost to aching gums might change the course of history more than any poisoned cup. You step back, letting the candle's glow shrink behind you. The tooth puller's tools glint one last time before the door closes. Ahead, the scents grow softer musk and rose waters swirl through corridors where perfumes hide rot and rumor alike. You follow the trail, ready to breathe what the court dares not name. The sharp sting of iron fades behind you as you drift into a passage scented with something far more pleasant, at least at first breath. Here the court's secrets take on sweeter notes. Rose water dabbed on linen musky oils dripped behind ears, sprigs of lavender tucked into silk sleeves. These perfumes promise refinement, but lean in closer, and they reveal a darker truth. Sometimes a fragrance is less a luxury than a disguise for decay. In the king's chambers, a heavy wooden chest stands half open, its velvet lining cradling cut glass bottles shaped like tiny cathedrals. Some hold rose attar, pressed from thousands of petals gathered at dawn. Others carry civet oil or ambergris exotic scents worth more than a common man's yearly wage. The court claims these perfumes ward off foul air miasmas they believed spread plague and putrefaction. But whisper among the laundresses, and you'll hear the quieter truth. The king's ulcers, the rotting teeth, the festering wounds, these could not be scrubbed away, only masked in rose and musk. A chambermaid moves lightly through the gloom, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear to block the smell of royal decay. She sprinkles scented vinegar across the stone floors, hoping to kill what lurks unseen. Some scholars argue these fragrant rituals did more to soothe courtiers' noses than heal the king's flesh. Still, the ledgers are thick with orders for new shipments. Sandalwood, from India, jasmine from Spain, pressed into oils to anoint royal pillows. Near the hearth sits a copper pan where herbs bubble low in water steam, curling upward like a blessing. An apothecary murmurs about cleansing the humors, about balancing wet and dry, cold and hot, yet his hands move more like a perfumer than a physician. He drips rose oil onto scraps of linen, folds them into sachets, tucks them into the king's sleeves and under his pillow. If the ulcers weep, let them smell of flowers instead of pus. A faint breeze carries a sharper scent, camphor maybe, or bitter myrrh, mixed into ointments rubbed over royal sores. One tale says Henry himself demanded perfumes, thick enough to drown out the rot his courtiers obliged burning incense until the tapestries reeked of spice. Historians still puzzle over whether this fragrant haze hid sickness or only made it bearable for those forced to kneel beside his bed. You trail your fingers along a dressing table cluttered with tiny jars, pastes tinted pink with crushed petals, creams scented with lemon balm and mint. An ivory comb rests beside a silver mirror, its handle sticky with dried oils. A half-burned candle sputters beside it, releasing a soft waft of beeswax mixed with lavender. The scene is oddly peaceful, yet you can't help but see the tension knotted in the perfumed hush beauty turned shield against what no cure could contain. A court gossip slips past you in the hall, murmuring to a page about a queen's chamber that reeks of roses so thickly the walls sweat perfume. He leans in, eyes wide. Did she hide more than a simple sore behind that scented veil, poison some whisper? Adultery, others hint. Or just the inevitable rot of a royal body ravaged by half a lifetime of questionable cures. You pause by a half-open window. Outside, fresh air stirs the tapestries. For a moment you imagine the king himself leaning here, once breathing deep of the same garden scents that perfumers now bottle for his sickbed. Did he believe each petal pressed into oil might buy him another month of grace? Some historians remain uncertain. Did the perfume soothe the king's pride more than his wounds? Or was it only the court's nose that demanded roses over reality? You step back into the corridor, the hush of musk and rose clinging to your sleeves. Ahead, candlelight flickers around relics, too holy for science bones, and scraps of saints pressed to infected flesh in desperate faith. The scent of miracles and false hope waits behind the next door. The sweet haze of rosewater fades as you slip into a darker chamber, where the air grows thick with candle smoke and whispers of salvation. Here medicine yields to faith, or perhaps faith becomes its own kind of cure. A dozen votive candles flicker against stone walls, their wavering light dancing across reliquaries of silver and glass. Within each tiny vessel lies a fragment of the divine, a saint's knucklebone, a shred of holy cloth, a splinter said to be from the true cross. You stand quietly near the entrance, watching a priest in worn robes lean over a figure sprawled on a narrow bed. The king's skin glistens with sweat bandages stained with secrets that rosewater failed to hide. Beside the bed sits an ornate reliquary, inside a piece of bone cradled in red velvet, guarded by locks and seals that no physician's scalpel would dare touch. The ritual is hushed, but heavy with hope. A low chant echoes from a dark corner, where another priest kneels muttering Latin syllables that tangle with the smell of tallow and burning herbs. An acolyte dips a strip of linen into holy oil, pressing it gently to an ulcer that no powder from Venice could tame. Some scholars argue whether these relics offered comfort placebo, or merely a desperate distraction when the body failed and the mind grew restless with fear. Near the altar, a box of beeswax candles waits, each stamped with a saint's mark. Servants light them one by one whenever the king's fever spikes, believing the flames' glow might drive out unseen demons as surely as any purge. You drift closer to a stone ledge where a stack of folded cloths rests, prayer cloths touched to reliquaries, then laid across the king's brow in the hush of midnight. Rumors swirl through the corridors. Some courtiers scoff at relics as peasant superstition, while others press donations into the priest's hands, hoping an extra coin might coax a miracle for a favor later. The king himself, it's said, swung between scorn and desperate belief. One night, he mocked the relic as a trinket. The next, he clutched it tight enough to bruise his palm. Historians still debate whether these relics offered anything more than a fleeting balm for a monarch's crumbling pride. A flicker of motion catches your eye. An elderly woman kneels by the bed lips, moving silently as she strokes a rosary worn smooth by generations. She's not a physician, nor a wise woman, just a mother to a mother, called to whisper prayers when all else fails. In her eyes, you see a faith that makes powders and scalpels seem crude by comparison. She presses the relic to the king's chest, murmuring a name only she can hear. You notice the relic's glass case is cracked old damage, perhaps, from a hurried journey across Europe's warring kingdoms. Some whisper, it's not even real, just a piece of bone from a common grave. Others insist the power comes not from the fragment, but the belief behind it. If enough people bow low, does it matter whether the bone belonged to a saint or a stranger? You lean against a pillar, feeling the cool stone beneath your palm as the candle flames waver. The scent of melting wax blends with the sharp tang of incense drifting from a brass censer. In this half light, the lines between healer and priest cure and prayer blur until they're one and the same. Behind you, the corridor hums with restless footsteps, servants fetching more candles, an apothecary muttering that the relics only prolong the inevitable. But inside this chamber, time slows to a hush, broken only by the soft rustle of robes and the faint drip of wax. You turn to go, leaving the flickering hope behind you. Ahead, rumors grow sharper. Poison drips into hushed conversations, and the line between cure and quiet murder begins to blur. The next doorway opens onto whispers that linger long after the candles burn out. You slip from the holy hush of relics into corridors thick with rumors that coil through the court like smoke. Here, healing and harm share a bed, for every cure in the Tudor palace casts a long shadow, one where a whispered word can turn medicine into murder. In a candlelit alcove, two courtiers lean close, their velvet sleeves brushing as they murmur about the king's latest draft. Was it truly powdered pearl, meant to calm a fever, or something darker slipped into the goblet while a physician looked away? In a world where remedies arrive in secret satchels and foreign powders, travel hidden in spice crates, poison needs no dramatic flourish, just an extra pinch, a careless swirl, a sip that promises health but delivers silence. You linger behind a tapestry, listening to fragments of gossip, a cupbearer found dead, a midwife's herbs confiscated, a trusted advisor suddenly bedbound after praising the wrong heir. Some historians still puzzle over these palace deaths. Accidents, unlucky illnesses, or the quiet handiwork of rivals who knew how to disguise malice as medicine. In the center of this quiet conspiracy stands the king himself, a man both protected and vulnerable, surrounded by healers who swear loyalty yet stand to gain if his pulse stops before dawn. One rumor drifts through the court like a half-remembered song, a drop of mercury hidden in a tonic, a purgative made too strong a powder that numbs not just pain, but breath. There's no shortage of suspects when a crown might shift with a single cough. You step through a small door into a side chamber lined with shelves of dried herbs. Sage, wormwood, foxglove, each labeled in a careful hand, each potent enough to heal or harm depending on who prepares the dose. A small glass vial catches the candlelight, its stopper sealed with black wax. No label marks its contents. You wonder who knows what's inside, or who dares to find out. A soft sound breaks your thoughts. A page boy stands frozen in the doorway, a tray balanced in trembling hands. On it sits a goblet, half full of wine, the surface rippling as his knuckles whiten around the stem. He glances behind him, then down the corridor, as if deciding whether to deliver the drink or let it slip shattering on cold stones. Some say poison is less about what's in the cup and more about who holds it. Near the hearth, an old apothecary stirs a mortar of pale powder, his eyes darting to the shadows as he works. He mutters under his breath about precise measures too much, and the king's pulse flutters. Too little, and the fever holds. Some scholars argue that these men desperate to please walked a tightrope between cure and crime forever, one wrong dose, away from a royal executioner's blade. A hush settles when the page moves again, disappearing down the hall with the tray. You watch the shadows swallow him whole, wondering whether the king will sip and sleep or sip and never wake. And if he does drift too deeply, who will bear the blame? A rival courtier, a wife hoping for freedom, a healer too clever for his own safety. You trail your fingers along a shelf where tiny clay jars stand in neat rows, ginger for digestion, valerian for sleep, belladonna for pain that runs too deep for prayer. Each is innocent until stirred into broth or wine. Each holds the same question whispered behind every silk curtain. What if this cure does more than heal? Some historians claim the Tudor court lived in constant fear of poison disguised as kindness. Others say the fear itself was the true poison corroding trust so thoroughly that every sip of medicine tasted faintly of betrayal. You step into the corridor again, feeling the rumor cling like damp wool. Ahead, a gentler chamber waits, where the king's queens bend over simmering pots, stirring remedies laced with love, ambition, and secrets of their own. You drift from shadowed whispers and sealed vials into a quieter corner of the palace, where the sharp edges of court intrigue soften under the gentle hush of queenly hands. Here, in a chamber draped with heavy tapestries and lit by warm hearth glow, the royal wives brew their own remedies, potions that promise comfort, faith, and perhaps a flicker of quiet power in a court where so much is taken from them. A heavy oak table sits at the heart of this hush, cluttered with ceramic bowls, sprigs of rosemary, and bundles of dried lavender bound with twine. A small copper pot steams over the fire, its contents stirring the air with a scent sweeter than anything found in the apothecary's shadowy den. Some scholars still wonder how much these royal remedies truly healed and how much they whispered secrets into the king's ear between spoonfuls. You slip closer to the hearth and catch sight of a slender hand stirring honey into warm milk. Imagine Catherine of Aragon, weary from endless miscarriages and whispered betrayals, brewing chamomile tea to soothe her husband's belly while her own remained empty. Or Anne Boleyn, rumored to mix tiny doses of exotic herbs that might bolster the king's failing vigor or cloud his thoughts just enough to bend his will her way. There is no ledger here, no Latin scribbles pinned to a shelf, only memory passed between mother and maid wife and lady-in-waiting. A recipe for calming draughts, a poultice to ease a festering sore, a syrup of rose hips to mask the bitterness of more aggressive cures. And yet each spoonful carries the same dangerous question: is this comfort or control? Near the window, a small glass bottle gleams in the moonlight, its stopper sealed with beeswax, its contents deep crimson. Some say it's no more than raspberry syrup for a sore throat. Others swear such bottles sometimes hid poppy tincture strong enough to lull a king into hours of dreamless sleep. Historians debate endlessly whether these queenly concoctions were acts of mercy or veiled rebellion. Did they soothe the king to health or silence him long enough to weave new plots in the shadows? A soft laugh breaks the hush, A lady-in-waiting stirs petals into a ceramic bowl while whispering gossip about which queen favored which remedy. One used sweet almond oil for swelling joints. Another tucked rosemary sprigs beneath the royal pillow to ward off nightmares. You wonder how many of these gentle touches came from love and how many from fear that a king's anger could burn hotter than any fever if he believed his queen meddled too boldly in the art of healing. In the corner, a servant kneels, grinding dried mint with a mortar and pestle. The rhythmic crunch carries an oddly soothing calm, masking the hum of secrets that flutter just beyond the velvet drapes. Somewhere beyond this chamber, physicians scoff at these domestic cures, yet they never protest too loudly when the king, wearied by their bleedings and purges, turns to a wife's quiet cup of broth. You trail your fingers across the table's edge, past tiny cloth sachets stuffed with lavender and rose petals. Their scent softens the air gentler than civet oil or ambergris, and far less foreign than the powders slipped through Venice. Here, in this hush, a queen's remedy holds more than medicinal promise. It holds trust, or at least the illusion of it, a sip of warmth in a kingdom cold with suspicion. A faint draught flickers the hearth, and you sense it behind every soothing brew lurks the same old question. How many kings slept deeper than they should have? How many queens tasted power in the steam rising from a copper pot? Some scholars say these tales are only rumor fairy stories spun by enemies of ambitious women. Others find scraps of letters, notes in the margins of court records, hints that truth and poison share the same spoon. As the fire pops and the copper pot hisses softly, you step away from this fragrant hush. Ahead, stone walls close tighter around secrets that shimmer like gold, where royal alchemists promised liquid miracles, yet delivered nothing but glinting dreams and empty flasks. You slip from the warmth of queenly brews into a colder wing of the palace, where secrets bubble in silence behind locked doors. Here, the walls hum with dreams spun from metals and whispered incantations. This is the tower's hidden domain, where royal alchemists swear they can coax liquid gold from base lead, turning sickness into health and folly into fortune. You pause at a narrow doorway, peering inside a chamber, lit by sputtering tallow candles. Shelves bow under glass flasks, copper alembics, and tarnished scales dusted with strange powders. An acrid smell curls through the air, a mix of burnt sulfur and damp stone sharp enough to make your eyes water. Somewhere behind you, the court gossips about these royal alchemists, half wizards, half quacks, all dangerous in their promises. Near the hearth, an old man in a stained doublet bends over a crucible, his fingers stained with something that glitters in the candlelight. You watch as he drops a pinch of silvery dust into the bubbling brew. It hisses spits, then settles back to a dull simmer. He mutters words in broken Latin, half spell, half prayer, as if the right syllable might persuade stubborn metals to transform. Some scholars argue this was all performance smoke and mirrors for kings who longed for easy miracles when bleeding bowls failed. A small chest near the wall holds the raw ingredients of these quiet dreams, lumps of lead wrapped in cloth shavings of copper, tiny vials of quicksilver sealed tight. One record claims an alchemist once fed the king a tincture laced with dissolved gold leaf, promising it would purify the royal humors from within. Whether the gold did anything but glitter on its way out remains a puzzle debated by historians to this day. You edge closer to a cluttered work table where brittle scraps of parchment lie beneath glass weights. Strange symbols dance across the pages, circles within circles, tiny suns and crescent moons, coded marks that hint at a secret only the initiates claim to grasp. The ink is smudged, the corners singed, as if the very paper feared to hold so much impossible promise. Stories drift from this chamber like smoke through an unbarred window. One rumor insists a royal alchemist nearly succeeded turning base metal into something that shimmered gold in candlelight. But when the king demanded proof, the glitter flaked away under his thumb, leaving behind only cheap brass and a man who vanished into the tower's deepest cell by sunrise. Another tale whispers of a potion brewed from mercury, and herbs claimed to cure Henry's festering leg. The brew fizzled into poison instead, though no one dared call it so to the king's face. A young apprentice scurries between shelves, eyes wide, arms full of glass jars that clink like fragile secrets. He pauses, noticing you in the half-light. You wonder if he believes these muttered spells, or simply repeats what his master taught him, hoping for a glimpse of real magic among the fumes. Historians still argue whether these alchemists were frauds or visionaries, if their experiments were the birthplace of chemistry or just gilded illusions for desperate kings. A single candle flickers near a shelf, where a small glass bottle sits, its contents swirling with something dark and iridescent. The label reads, Aurum potabile, drinkable gold. Some courtiers claim the king once sipped this elixir from a goblet rimmed with real gold leaf, believing it would mend his rotting wounds from within. All it mended, perhaps, was the alchemist's purse. You breathe in the sour air, metallic heavy, with promises that never keep. In this tower room, gold is not wealth, but hope dissolved grain by grain in vinegar and lies. The king's faith in these secret brews outlasted sense, for when every leech and bleeding failed, who could resist believing a miracle might yet simmer under a copper lid? You turn away, leaving crucibles to bubble and parchments to gather soot. Ahead, the hush of kitchens waits, where royal diets promise health, but rot more than teeth and trust alike. You slip from the alchemist's smoky dreams into the hush of the royal kitchens, where the promise of nourishment curls warm and sweet through stone halls. Here, food itself becomes a kind of cure. At least that's what the king's physicians claim, as they hover near steaming pots, advising cooks how best to heal a monarch's humors with sugared almonds and candied fruits. You stand near the wide hearth, watching a cook in a linen cap stir a heavy pot of spiced syrup. The scent is enough to make your teeth ache, rosewater honey, and sugar boiled until it clings to spoons in thick drips. Nearby, a platter holds marzipan shaped into tiny swans, each brushed with gold leaf to catch the candlelight. These delicate confections are no mere indulgence. They're prescribed, justified as strengthening the royal body with sweetness that nourishes and soothes the heart. Some scholars still argue whether these sweet cures offered comfort or simply hastened the rot that gnawed at royal gums and gut alike. A scullion lad slips past you, carrying a tray piled with candied violets and sugar-dusted figs. He whispers a joke to another servant about how His Majesty's teeth won't stand a chance, yet no one laughs too loudly. The king's appetite is a rumor, all its own. Some say he devours honey cakes before dawn, others that his tongue, blistered by too many spiced wines and syrupy tarts, can no longer taste the bitterness lurking behind these sticky cures. You drift closer to a side table where jars of preserves gleam like tiny stained glass windows, pear compote, quince jelly sugared ginger, imported at obscene expense. One record hints that Henry believed sweet syrups might flush poisons from his humors, that sugar itself, so rare and precious, must hold curative powers if eaten in enough measure. Physicians scribbled prescriptions that sound like pastry orders. Take rose conserve daily, mixed with cinnamon sugar. Chew candied lemon peel at dawn to sweeten the breath and warm the belly. A physician in dark robes stands near the ovens, dabbing at his lips with a linen square after sampling a tart. He nods approval at the cook, though his eyes drift toward the corner where waste buckets overflow with peels and rinds. Behind that polite nod, you sense the quiet despair. He knows no sugared plum will cure an ulcer that weeps through bandages. No rose preserve will calm a fever that laughs at syrup and spice alike. Historians still puzzle over whether these royal diets were genuine medicine or a courtly excuse for indulgence that corroded from within. Beside the hearth, an older cook mutters about the king's swollen joints. Too much meat, too many pies. Yet here they stand, glazing sweet pastries for his supper. One tray bears health pastilles, tiny sugar lozenges laced with mint and clove. Another holds candied rose petals meant to sweeten the stomach after heavy meats. You can almost see the contradiction glistening on each plate: sweetness as cure, sweetness as poison. A faint scratching sound drifts from a corner, where rats scurry in the shadows, drawn by the same sugar that seduces royal tongues. You wonder if they too believe in its healing powers, or simply savor a feast left behind by those who trust that sweetness wards off death better than any bitter draught. You pause by a rack of spitted meats, fat sizzling and dripping onto crackling fires. Amid this abundance, you sense the rot cavities hidden behind regal smiles, ulcers fed by syrup instead of salve, a body that swells on delicacies while its veins run thin from bleedings and purges. Some scholars claim sugar was the king's truest poison, slow sweet, and all the more dangerous for its gilded disguise. You step away from the hearth's warmth, leaving the syrupy hush behind. Ahead waits the rustle of silk sleeves and hidden charms, amulets tucked beneath royal collars, tiny prayers sewn into seams, in hopes they might do what no sugared plum ever could. You step out of the kitchens and into a quieter corridor where sweetness gives way to secrets stitched beneath royal silk. Here, no vials bubble, no copper pans simmer. Instead, faith and fear find refuge in tiny charms, amulets and scraps of parchment sewn into sleeves and hidden hems. A different kind of cure, one that does not taste or bleed, but whispers protection with every rustle of fabric. In a narrow chamber, lined with cedar chests, you watch a seamstress bent over a royal doublet, her needle flickering through heavy velvet. Beside her lies a small pile of charms, tiny pewter medallions stamped with saints' faces, scraps of parchment inked with prayers in looping Latin beads of jet strung onto thin leather cords. If you lean closer, you can almost read the fading words, invocations for strength, protection, and the quiet warding off of poison and plague. Some say these charms were the only real medicine that traveled everywhere, with the king tucked inside cuffs, pinned behind collars, knotted into garters. You imagine Henry striding through the palace, his heavy robes brushing stone floors each step, accompanied by the soft jangle of a saint's token hidden from curious eyes. Historians still debate whether these charms did anything beyond soothe anxious hearts, but in a world where bleeding bowls failed and Venetian powders ran thin, hope was a prescription no physician could forbid. A lady in waiting stands near a candle, whispering instructions to a maid who threads a tiny sachet into the lining of a queen's sleeve. Inside dried rosemary and vervain, bound with a single human hair, rumored to ward off envy and betrayal as much as illness. You wonder who first thought a scrap of herb could stop a courtier's poisoned cup, or turn aside a physician's dull blade. Near the door, a chest stands open, its compartments filled with amulets of every kind, small copper coins etched with crosses, wax seals pressed with family crests, even fragments of old relics smuggled into garments, when the king's chapel could not supply enough faith for so many threats. A small velvet pouch rattles when nudged inside a piece of bone no bigger than a sparrow's claw. Some claim it belonged to a saint, others to a rat. The truth matters less than the comfort it lends when stitched beneath silk. You slip closer to a half-finished gown spread over a low table. Tiny bells are sewn along the hem, not for music, but to ward off spirits said to cling to sickbeds. The seamstress hums as she works her needle, pulling bright thread through shadows older than any doctor's cure. If you listen hard enough, you almost hear the unspoken wish in every stitch. Let this keep him safe. Let this be enough. One rumor tells of a charm stitched into Henry's hunting cloak, a tiny lead circle inscribed with Kabbalistic symbols hidden under the collar, so no rival's arrow might find its mark. Did it work? The king lived to feast another day, though some argue the charm's real magic was the confidence it lent his trembling huntsman, not the king himself. In the hush of this chamber, the seamstress lifts her eyes just once as if sensing your curiosity. She says nothing. Her needle speaks for her binding thread to fabric fear to hope. Some scholars wonder if these hidden amulets did more to shape royal fate than all the bleeding bowls and foreign powders combined. If nothing else, they offered a whisper of protection that no physician could bottle. You pull back from the flickering candlelight, the scent of lavender and wax trailing in your wake. Ahead, another hush deepens the king's healers. Gather at a bedside, their learned hands, empty at last, their final despair sealed behind tight lips as they watch the shadows settle over the cure they could not command. You leave behind the seamstress's whispered prayers and step into a colder chamber, where silk sleeves and secret amulets have no power left to give. Here, the hush is heavy thick, with the helplessness of men who once wielded blades and powders with the confidence of gods, but now stand silent, staring at a monarch they can no longer mend. You linger near the threshold, watching the king's healers gather around a canopied bed. Their velvet caps cast long shadows on stone walls, the flickering fire making their eyes look hollow and small. One physician clutches a sheaf of notes, fever charts, bleeding tallies lists of every draft and potion the king's lips have tasted this month alone. His hands tremble as he flips the pages, searching for some overlooked cure hidden between the ink. A silver bowl sits abandoned on a low table, half full of darkened water, meant to catch more royal blood. Beside it, a brass pan holds scraps of herbs, rosemary gone dry, sage wilted to gray threads. A sweet, stale smell of rosewater clings to the bedding, doing little to mask the sour edge of sickness that leaks through every silk sheet. Some scholars say these final moments prove how fragile Tudor medicine truly was, how much faith the crown placed in learned men, who at the end could only stand by and watch nature claim what their blades and brews could not heal. One healer leans forward, pressing 2 fingers to the king's wrist. He counts silently, lips moving around numbers he does not trust. Another physician, older and stooped, whispers to a young apprentice who scribbles each word onto parchment as if any detail might matter now. In a corner, an unused jar of imported powder sits unopened, another trade secret that arrived too late or promised too much. You watch as a courtier slips in, face pale under his feathered cap. He asks the question none of the healers want to answer. What more can be done? The oldest physician clears his throat, but says nothing. He only gestures to the soft rise and fall of the king's chest, each breath shallow, caught somewhere between here and the hush beyond. A rumor flickers through the chamber like a dying candle. Some say the physicians argue even now whether to bleed him. One final time drain the last ounces of bad humors clinging stubbornly to life. Others whisper they dare not touch him again, for fear the court will blame them when his final breath rattles loose. Historians still puzzle over these records. Did they hold back to spare him, or stand helpless because they had simply run out of ideas to try? By the hearth, a single leech floats motionless in a small clay pot, once so eager to draw sickness away, now as still as the healers who dare not place it on royal skin again. The chamber's hush deepens with the knowledge that their methods, so carefully taught and fiercely defended, have brought them here to silence, to stillness, to a king slipping away under the weight of secrets they can't bleed out or bind up with ribbon and prayer. A flicker of movement draws your eye. An apprentice folds the velvet covers higher up the king's chest, tucking them in, as if warmth alone might anchor him to this side of the hush. The oldest physician bows his head, not in prayer, but in resignation. His hands, stained with decades of mixing, cutting, stirring, now hang useless at his sides. You wonder if in these final moments they think of the wise women they dismissed as superstition, of the queenly remedies they mocked as household gossip, of the relics they rolled their eyes at when pressed to infected flesh. In this final hush, no charm, no spice from Venice, no silver bowl, brimming with royal blood can matter now. You step back from the bed, your breath catching at the hush that fills the space where whispered Latin once danced. Ahead, the hush deepens even more. Past this chamber waits the tomb where failed secrets and faithful cures are laid to rest, together sealed behind stone that keeps its silence better than any courtier ever could. You stand at the threshold of the final hush, a place colder than any physician's chamber, quieter than any reliquary shrine. Here all the bleeding bowls, secret powders, holy bones, and whispered charms come to rest beneath stone and earth, buried with the man who once sat crowned above them all. The tomb waits deep within the chapel walls, a slab of carved marble that promises eternity, yet seals away centuries of failed cures and desperate hopes. You drift closer, the flickering light of iron sconces guiding your steps down worn stone steps. The air here is thick with cold and candle smoke, the scent of lilies wilting in brass vases set along the walls. Some say the flowers mask what time will always reclaim, but even the sweetest bloom can't hush decay forever. A handful of courtiers gather in the half-light black sleeves, brushing the dusty floor as they bow low to the stone effigy. They whisper prayers they barely believe, small apologies for things done and undone cures given and withheld. The king lies beneath them, now wrapped in fine linen, a ring still on one swollen finger, a scrap of lavender sewn into the final folds of silk. Whether he believed more in relics or leeches at the end, no one can say. The records argue about it. Scholars still pull at those threads centuries later, finding no answer tucked in the margins of royal ledgers. Near the head of the tomb, a sealed chest rests on cold flagstones. Inside, they say, are the king's personal relics, vials of foreign powders, a brass bleeding bowl, scraps of parchment scribbled with herbal cures, a chipped pewter charm once hidden in his hunting cloak. Some claim these should have been burned to guard against superstition. Others argue they were buried at his command, as if to carry the comfort of cures he trusted more than the hands that failed him. You lean closer, tracing the faint outline of his name etched into marble. Beneath your palm, the stone hums with all that went unsaid secrets that fled through midnight corridors, whispered promises of new cures smuggled in from Venice, hidden poisons rumored to linger in the goblets passed hand to hand. In this hush, none of it matters now. A priest murmurs a final blessing, his voice echoing off cold walls. Behind him, an apprentice physician stands silently clutching a battered satchel. He wonders if any of his remedies will be buried with him one day, if someone will stand above his bones, debating whether his scalpels healed more than they harmed. Some historians say this tomb is less the end of a king and more the graveyard of an entire age of cure-alls, where faith and guesswork lay side by side, their secrets locked tighter than any iron chest. A draft slips through the chapel, stirring the edge of a faded banner that hangs near the vault door. You imagine the queens, who once bent low here, pressing a hand to the cold marble, whispering regrets, or maybe quiet relief. Perhaps they left a single charm tucked into the folds of stone, a sprig of rosemary, a scrap of linen, a final prayer to keep him safe where no wise woman's brew or foreign powder ever could. In this hush, the failed secrets sleep beside their king. The silver bowls are stacked in dusty cupboards, the leech jars dry and forgotten. Somewhere above, new physicians pace polished halls, mixing new cures, promising better answers. But here beneath carved marble, the old questions linger like echoes in stone. What healed, what harmed, what was trusted too blindly to ever be true. You turn away from the tomb, your footsteps soft against the ancient floor. The hush holds. The secrets remain. And somewhere in the drifting candle smoke, you sense a final truth. All cures like kings must one day sleep. Let the hush deepen now. Let the flicker of candlelight fade behind closed eyes. Imagine the old stone chapel growing softer, colder, more distant, until the weight of ancient secrets drifts harmlessly away. Feel the echo of footsteps, slow, to silence the scent of rosewater and rosemary melting into the dark. There is nothing more to heal tonight. No powders to swallow. No potions to stir. No whispered promise of a cure yet to come. Only the soft hush of stone, the gentle rest of worn marble, the quiet truth that some things in the end are meant to be laid to sleep. May your own thoughts settle like dust in an empty reliquary, peaceful and still. And when you drift off tonight, imagine that somewhere in the hush of old corridors, another story waits, another secret, another cure, another king ready to share his quiet dream with you.